The night at La Belle Époque was more than just another evening of fine dining. It was an experience meticulously crafted to seduce the senses. Soft candlelight flickered across the crystal chandeliers, sending cascades of shimmering light over tables draped with imported linen. The air was rich with the mingling scents of rosemary, truffle oil, and seared Wagyu beef, setting the perfect stage for the city's elite to gather, sip their vintage wines, and immerse themselves in the grandeur that only Daniel Harrington could conjure. Daniel stood near the bar, his sharp gaze scanning the room for the subtlest hint of imperfection. At 35, he was the very embodiment of refined ambition. Tall, with impeccably styled brown hair, and a suit tailored so perfectly it seemed to be a part of him. The whispers about his reserved and calculating nature were true. He held himself with an aloof professionalism that demanded respect but rarely invited warmth. Yet, tonight, as he took a sip of his Merlot, a familiar restlessness tugged at the edges of his mind, a feeling he'd long buried under years of success and luxury. Across the room, laughter bubbled up from a couple at a central table, the sound punctuating the murmur of conversations and the occasional clink of glasses. It was a scene Daniel had witnessed countless times, yet tonight, he felt an unusual dissonance. He turned his attention to the entrance, where a sudden movement caught his eye. The main doors opened with an uncharacteristic abruptness. A woman, clearly out of place, hesitated at the threshold. She was young, perhaps late 20s, with dark hair that fell in tangled waves over her worn coat. Her eyes were sharp, almost defiant, but beneath that glimmer was a weariness Daniel knew all too well. Her gaze flitted across the room, pausing as if calculating whether she was about to make the best, or worst, decision of her life. Her name was Sophie Turner, and though years had changed her, Daniel's heart skipped when recognition struck. Memories he had once cherished and then forced into the recesses of his mind threatened to resurface. Sophie, who had been a constant in his childhood, had vanished from his life one day without explanation, leaving only echoes of innocent laughter and whispered promises. Sophie stepped forward, the faint tremble of hunger betraying her composure. Gasps and murmurs followed her as she navigated between tables, the clatter of heels on polished wood blending with the hushed disapproval of patrons. Daniel's muscles tensed, an internal battle waging between his professionalism and the pull of the past. Before he could process what he was doing, he set down his glass and began moving toward her. Sophie's eyes darted around as she reached a partially cleared table. The untouched remnants of a decadent dish lay there, tempting her beyond reason. The noise in the room seemed to fade as she grabbed a fork and began to eat, her hands shaking. The sudden break in the routine of La Belle Époque drew the attention of everyone. Waiters paused mid-step, and the pianist missed a note. The buzz of conversation dwindled into a stunned silence, punctuated by a single, sharp exclamation. "What on earth is she doing?" Daniel stood a few paces away, frozen by a wave of conflicting emotions. The girl devouring leftovers at one of his prized tables was a shadow of the Sophie he'd once known. Gone was the bright-eyed friend who'd shared dreams of exploration and freedom. In her place was a woman marked by hardship. "Miss, you can't," a waiter began, only to be silenced by the soft but firm gesture of Daniel's hand. "Sophie," he said, voice steady, carrying a tone of familiarity that surprised even him. Her movements halted abruptly, and for a moment, the room held its breath. Sophie's head turned slowly, eyes meeting his with a mix of recognition and defiance. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, time seemed to unravel. Daniel saw not the disheveled intruder standing before him, but the girl who had once been his entire world. Yet Sophie's eyes, though familiar, held stories untold, stories that hinted at a journey as painful as it was mysterious. Before anyone could react, Sophie's expression shifted. She set the fork down carefully, as if suddenly aware of the eyes upon her. With a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I'm sorry." The sound cut through the tension like a blade. Daniel swallowed hard, the room around him receding into a blur. He stepped forward, heart pounding, as the weight of their shared history bore down on them both. The room slowly exhaled as Daniel stepped closer to Sophie, his measured pace drawing the eyes of every onlooker. For a man who rarely showed emotion, his expression now was an enigma, a blend of shock, worry, and something deeper. Sophie's gaze flickered with indecision, torn between staying and bolting out the door before the past fully caught up with her. "Sophie, wait," Daniel spoke, a hint of urgency softening his usually controlled tone. He gestured toward an empty corner table, one away from prying eyes. The murmurs of the crowd resumed as waiters returned to their tasks, but the hum of curiosity remained palpable. Sophie hesitated. She had been conditioned by years of hardship to read situations carefully. The Daniel Harrington she remembered from childhood was kind and full of wild ideas, but this man in front of her, with his tailored suit and practiced composure, was almost unrecognizable. Yet, the familiarity in his eyes held a trace of the boy who once promised to be her partner in crime. With a slight nod, Sophie allowed herself to be led to the secluded table. The weight of her reality pressed down as she sat across from him, fingers tightly clasping each other in her lap. A stark contrast to the elegant figures gracing the restaurant. Daniel signaled a waiter, who approached with a hesitant glance. "A menu for the lady, please," Daniel said, his eyes never leaving Sophie. The waiter nodded, retreating quickly. Silence settled between them, heavy and charged with unspoken words. Daniel leaned back, studying her. The once vibrant girl he remembered had been replaced by a woman whose eyes told stories of resilience and survival. Sophie's hands relaxed slightly as she met his gaze, her voice quivering as she spoke first. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," she said, barely above a whisper. I was hungry." The rawness of her confession struck Daniel, chipping away at the mask he wore so well. "I know," he replied, softer than he intended. A pause lingered before he continued, "It's been a long time, Sophie." She nodded, looking away as memories rushed back. Days spent running barefoot through fields, dreaming about the future, and nights spent talking under the stars. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago, a time before loss and hardship had redefined who she was. The waiter returned with a menu, placing it before Sophie with a polite bow. She glanced at it, the luxurious descriptions of dishes almost laughable against the backdrop of her current reality. Her throat tightened, a reminder of how far she had fallen. Daniel leaned forward, breaking the silence. "Order whatever you'd like. No one's judging you here." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I think they already did," she said, her voice tinged with a weary humor. But the look in Daniel's eyes was sincere, devoid of the patronizing pity she had come to expect. She nodded, more to herself than to him, and chose something simple, a bowl of soup, almost as if to minimize the act of kindness she was about to accept. As they waited, Daniel couldn't hold back his curiosity. "Where have you been all these years?" The question came out more direct than he intended, but Sophie only shrugged, her eyes losing focus as if seeing something far away. "Everywhere and nowhere," she replied, the vague answer cloaked in memories too painful to share. "After my parents died, there wasn't anyone left." The mention of her parents made Daniel's chest tighten. He remembered the funeral, the whispered condolences, and then the silence that followed when Sophie seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. He had assumed she'd been taken in by distant relatives, perhaps moved to another city. But now, seeing her here, it was clear that assumption had been a convenient lie he told himself. The soup arrived, steam curling upward as the warm aroma enveloped Sophie. She wrapped her hands around the bowl, savoring the heat before taking a tentative sip. It was the first real meal she'd had in days, and the taste, simple yet rich, filled her with a strange mix of gratitude and shame. Daniel watched her in silence, noting the slight tremble in her fingers. He felt a pang of guilt for not seeking her out sooner, for assuming life had carried her gently. But this wasn't the time for regret. It was time for action. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he said, the words surprising even himself. Her eyes snapped to his, wide with surprise. Apologies were rare in the world she'd come to know. Before she could respond, Daniel continued, his voice steady but pained. "For not being there, for letting you slip away. I didn't know." She held his gaze, the weight of his words settling between them like a fragile truce. In that moment, the restaurant around them faded into the background. It was just Daniel and Sophie, two people bound by memories and the unspoken promise of a second chance. The rest of the meal passed with few words, but the silence spoke volumes. And when the final spoonful of soup had been consumed, Daniel set down his glass, determination hardening his features. "You're not going back out there, Sophie," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Not tonight." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, caught between relief and uncertainty. For the first time in years, the idea of safety didn't seem so far away. Sophie's mind spun as she processed Daniel's declaration. The warmth of the soup still lingered in her chest, a stark contrast to the chill that usually accompanied her nights. She met his determined gaze, a flicker of defiance surfacing. "And what then, Daniel?" she asked, forcing a shaky laugh. "Do I just pretend everything is fine and go back to living a life that doesn't exist?" Daniel's expression softened, the lines of his usually composed face etched with concern. "You don't have to pretend, Sophie, but you don't have to face this alone anymore." He reached for the wine glass in front of him, taking a sip to steady himself. Memories of his own struggles, ones he had buried beneath layers of ambition, clawed their way to the surface. For too long, he had believed that distance from his past would keep him safe, but seeing Sophie reminded him that no one could truly escape who they were. The restaurant had begun to empty, the last patrons paying their checks or lingering for final sips of expensive liqueur. The ambient noise softened to a gentle hum as waiters discreetly cleared tables. Yet, Daniel and Sophie remained rooted in their conversation, oblivious to the fading crowd. Sophie's eyes fell to her hands, the nails chipped and fingers roughed from countless days of hardship. "Why now?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Why would you care after all these years?" Daniel's gaze didn't falter. "Because I should have cared all along," he said, each word deliberate, as though admitting it lifted a weight off his chest. "I don't know what I can do to change what's happened, but I know I can start by making sure you're safe tonight." A lump formed in Sophie's throat, but she forced it down. Accepting help meant vulnerability, something she had learned to avoid. The world was rarely kind to those who needed it most. But Daniel's voice, his presence, carried an air of authenticity she hadn't felt in years. The door to the kitchen swung open as Marcus, the head chef, stepped out, his eyes scanning the room until they found Daniel. A tall man with a thick beard and a booming voice, Marcus had been a loyal employee for over a decade. He raised an eyebrow when he saw Sophie, but kept his thoughts to himself. "Daniel, closing up soon?" Marcus asked, wiping his hands on a towel. The question seemed routine, but the chef's eyes darted to Sophie with subtle curiosity. "Yes, Marcus. Just finishing up here," Daniel responded, a slight nod of reassurance that said he had everything under control. With a grunt, Marcus returned to the kitchen, leaving them alone again. The quiet in the restaurant grew, stretching into the kind of silence that asked for answers. Sophie sighed, the resistance in her posture softening as exhaustion seeped in. She looked at Daniel, truly looked at him for the first time that night. The sharp edges of his suit, the controlled mannerisms, all hinted at a man who had built walls as high as hers, but for different reasons. "I don't know what you expect me to say," she admitted. The admission felt heavy, pulling at the fragile threads of her pride. "I'm not the girl you remember, Daniel. I'm not sure I know who I am anymore." Daniel's brow furrowed, a small frown marring his otherwise confident features. "Neither am I," he said softly. The confession hung between them, surprising them both. "But maybe it's time we figured that out." The words resonated with Sophie more than she wanted to admit. The part of her that longed for stability, for a moment of respite, whispered that maybe this time she could afford to take a risk. Maybe this time, reaching for an outstretched hand wouldn't lead to another fall. "Okay," she said finally, the single word breaking the tension in her chest. "Just for tonight." Daniel's relief was palpable. "Just for tonight," he echoed, though something in his voice hinted that he intended to make it much more than that. He stood, signaling for a waiter to approach. "Call the driver, please," he said. The young man nodded and left swiftly. Turning back to Sophie, Daniel's voice was gentle. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." Sophie pushed her chair back, the scrape of wood against the polished floor sounding louder than it should have. The weight of what she was about to do pressed on her, but she followed Daniel as he led her through the now quiet restaurant. The glances from the remaining staff were brief, more curious than critical. Daniel's hand rested lightly at her back, a subtle gesture that promised safety. Outside, the city of San Francisco was alive with its usual nighttime symphony. Car engines rumbling, distant laughter from passing groups, the occasional bark of a street vendor selling late-night snacks. The cool air nipped at Sophie's cheeks, reminding her of just how cold the world could be. But tonight, there was a warmth beside her, a promise she hadn't dared to believe in for years. A sleek black car pulled up, the driver stepping out and opening the door. Daniel gestured for Sophie to get in, his expression unreadable yet reassuring. She hesitated only for a moment before climbing inside. The leather seat felt foreign against her worn coat, a stark reminder of the divide between the life she had and the life she once imagined. As Daniel joined her and the car began to move, Sophie stared out the window, the lights of the city blurring into streaks. She felt the pull of exhaustion and let her eyes close, just for a moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a fragile hope that tomorrow might be different. The ride to Daniel's home was quiet, filled only with the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of Sophie's coat as she shifted. Her mind was a tangle of nerves and exhaustion, and she fought to stay alert, eyes opening briefly whenever the car turned or slowed. Daniel sat beside her, hands folded in his lap, gazing out the opposite window as if the passing buildings held answers to the questions swirling in his head. The city streets gave way to tree-lined roads, their canopies forming shadows that flitted over the car's interior like ghosts of old memories. Sophie glanced sideways at Daniel, taking in the sharp line of his jaw, the way his brow furrowed in deep thought. He looked as composed as ever, yet there was something different now, an air of vulnerability she hadn't expected. The car finally pulled up to a large wrought iron gate that slowly creaked open, revealing a sprawling estate bathed in soft, golden light. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had known Daniel had done well for himself, but seeing it laid out before her was overwhelming. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines and expansive glass windows that reflected the stars above. The driver stepped out to open the door, and Daniel was the first to move, offering Sophie a hand as she exited. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting, the warmth of his touch grounding her more than she wanted to admit. "Come inside," Daniel said, his voice gentle but carrying an unspoken assurance that this was no longer up for debate. He led her up the stone steps and into the foyer, where the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers enveloped them. The soft glow from wall sconces illuminated the space, casting long shadows that danced as they moved. Sophie's gaze darted around, taking in the luxurious surroundings, the high ceilings, the art pieces that seemed more suited to a gallery than a home, and the sleek, minimalist furniture. It was everything she would have imagined for someone who had turned ambition into empire, and yet it felt cold, impersonal. It was a stark contrast to the Daniel she used to know, whose room had been cluttered with sketchbooks and random trinkets. "Wait here," Daniel said, interrupting her thoughts. He disappeared down a hallway, leaving Sophie alone with the quiet thrum of her heartbeat. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly hyper-aware of the state of her clothing, the grime that clung to her from too many nights spent outdoors. A minute later, Daniel returned with a soft robe draped over his arm. "You can use the guest bathroom to freshen up," he said, motioning to a door off to the side. "Take your time." Sophie nodded, unable to find words as she accepted the robe and made her way to the bathroom. The room was as elegant as the rest of the house, with marble counters and a rain shower that looked like it belonged in a spa. She turned the lock and caught her reflection in the mirror. Dark hair tangled around her face, eyes shadowed by fatigue. The sight brought a lump to her throat. This wasn't who she was supposed to be. The warm water cascaded over her, washing away layers of grime and weariness. She lingered longer than she needed, savoring the heat and the rare moment of safety. When she finally emerged, the robe wrapped around her, Sophie felt lighter, almost human again. Daniel was waiting in the living room when she returned, a steaming cup of tea resting on the glass coffee table in front of him. He looked up as she entered, a hint of relief softening his expression. "Feel better?" She nodded, sitting cautiously on the edge of the plush armchair across from him. The warmth of the tea seeped into her fingers as she cradled the cup. Its delicate scent a balm to her frayed nerves. Silence hung between them, not awkward but weighted with the understanding that there was much to be said. "You didn't have to do all this," Sophie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes searching hers. "I did," he countered softly. "I owed it to you, to us." The word us struck a chord deep within Sophie, stirring memories of childhood promises whispered under tree canopies and shared laughter that once felt like it could outlast anything. But life had proved otherwise, and now they sat here, two people shaped by different battles. "I don't know what comes next," Sophie admitted, a tremor betraying her vulnerability. "I'm not even sure I can stay. I've survived by moving, by not letting myself get comfortable." Daniel's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, processing her words. "I can't force you to stay," he said finally, a shadow of disappointment flickering across his features. "But I want you to know there's a place for you here, at least until you figure things out." A strange warmth settled in Sophie's chest, a mixture of gratitude and fear. The safety of what he offered was both alluring and daunting. "Why do you care so much, Daniel?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them like a challenge. He took a deep breath, eyes darkening with an emotion that had long been buried. "Because when I lost you, I lost a part of myself, too." The words lingered, wrapping around Sophie like a forgotten melody. For the first time in years, the wall she had built so meticulously began to show cracks. They sat in silence as the night deepened, two souls finding their way back to each other under the dim glow of the chandelier. The hours ticked by as the city outside Daniel's expansive windows began to wind down. Streetlights cast a soft glow over the quiet streets, and the faint hum of the occasional car was the only sound that punctuated the silence in the room. Sophie sat in the armchair, her fingers still clutching the now empty cup, her mind a whirl of emotions. Daniel's confession had left her exposed, peeling back the layers of steel she'd wrapped herself in over the years. Daniel stood and walked to the large window that framed the glittering San Francisco skyline. His reflection looked back at him, sharp, composed, but with eyes that spoke of years spent carrying more weight than most knew. He exhaled slowly, breaking the silence that hung between them. "Sophie, I know this is sudden. I'm not trying to push you into anything," he said, turning to face her. His voice was measured, the way he always spoke when he was trying to tread carefully. "But seeing you here tonight, it reminded me of what I once lost, and I can't stand the thought of losing it again." Sophie looked up at him, the earnestness in his words slicing through her guarded heart. The Daniel she remembered had always been steady, even as a boy. But now, standing before her, he was not just steady. He was unyielding. It was both comforting and terrifying. "You don't owe me anything, Daniel," she replied, a hint of resistance in her voice. "Life happened, and we both went our ways. I don't want you to feel like you have to." "I don't feel obligated," he interrupted, a rare sharpness coloring his tone before it softened again. "This isn't about obligation. It's about making choices I didn't make back then, about not letting fate decide everything for us." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sophie's heart clenched. Part of her wanted to believe that this was real, that he could be her anchor. But another part, the part forged in years of surviving on her own, whispered caution. Trusting meant opening herself up to more pain, and she wasn't sure she could afford that again. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant chime of a clock somewhere in the house. Daniel's eyes stayed on her, watching every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. "You don't know what I've been through," she said finally, her voice soft but laced with the weight of countless untold stories. "You might think you want this now, but when the reality of who I am now sinks in—" "I want to know," Daniel said, stepping forward. The distance between them felt less like a room and more like a chasm they both needed to cross. "I want to know everything, Sophie. We don't have to rush this, but I'm here, and I'm not walking away this time." The intensity of his words made Sophie's eyes sting with unshed tears. She looked away, focusing on a painting on the wall. A serene landscape, lush with rolling hills and an endless blue sky. It was a scene that felt miles away from where she was now, both in body and spirit. "I'm tired, Daniel," she admitted, the confession tumbling out before she could stop it. "I'm tired of running, of being on edge all the time. But I don't know if I can just stop. Trusting, staying still. It doesn't come naturally anymore." Daniel nodded, as if he understood the depths of what she was saying. "Then don't make any decisions tonight," he said, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint, reassuring smile. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we can start to figure things out, one step at a time." The offer, simple yet profound, wrapped around her like a warm blanket. For the first time in years, Sophie felt the tiniest flicker of hope that maybe she didn't have to shoulder everything alone. She stood, the robe shifting around her as she moved. "Where can I?" "I'll show you," Daniel said, gesturing for her to follow. He led her down a hallway lined with photographs and abstract art, the soft glow of lamps casting golden light across the walls. They passed doors that were closed, hints of Daniel's life beyond what she knew. He opened a door near the end of the hallway, revealing a guest room that was understated yet welcoming. The bed was neatly made with crisp, white linens, and a small armchair sat in the corner by a window that looked out over the quiet city. "It's not much, but it's perfect," Sophie said, cutting him off before he could continue. The room was more than enough. It was safe, it was warm, and it was more than she'd had in a long time. She turned to look at him, gratitude softening the tension in her features. "Thank you, Daniel." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to dissolve. He nodded, a smile ghosting across his lips. "Good night, Sophie." "Good night," she echoed, watching as he stepped out and gently closed the door behind him. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. Sophie walked to the window, staring out at the world she had once loved and feared. The skyline glittered with a million tiny lights, each one representing lives, stories, and possibilities. With a deep breath, she sank into the bed, the sheets cool and soft against her skin. It felt foreign, but not unwelcome. As her eyes closed, she let herself believe, if only for a moment, that this was the start of something new, something that might finally bring her peace. The early morning light filtered through the gauzy curtains of the guest room, casting soft, golden hues that gently pulled Sophie from sleep. For a moment, disorientation set in, the unfamiliar comfort making her heart race. But as the memories of the previous night returned, she exhaled, the tension in her body slowly ebbing away. She was at Daniel's house, a place she never thought she'd see from the inside, much less wake up in. Sophie sat up, brushing stray hair from her face. The soft cotton of the robe Daniel had given her still hugged her form, a tangible reminder that this wasn't another harsh morning on the streets. She let her fingers run over the fabric, absorbing the reality of the moment before rising to peer out the window. San Francisco stretched before her, the bay glistening under the morning sun, and the city's iconic hills rolling into the distance. It looked serene, almost deceptively so, given the battles she had fought within these very streets. Sophie's stomach growled, a sharp reminder that yesterday's soup hadn't been enough. The thought of walking into Daniel's kitchen, of finding her way around his home, made her pause. She wasn't used to the quiet intimacy of spaces like this anymore. A soft knock on the door startled her, and she turned, pulling the robe tighter instinctively. Daniel's voice, muffled but unmistakable, came through. "Sophie, are you up?" "Yeah," she replied, her voice catching slightly. She cleared her throat and said it again, stronger this time. "Yes, I'm up." The door opened, and Daniel stepped in, looking more casual than she'd ever seen him. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by a fitted sweater and dark jeans. He carried a tray with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a plate of pastries that filled the room with the warm, buttery scent of baked goods. "I thought you might want breakfast," he said, placing the tray on the small table by the window. The sunlight caught the warm tones in his hair, making him look almost boyish, a brief flash of the Daniel she used to know. Sophie's stomach twisted, not just from hunger, but from the sudden rush of gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her. "Thank you," she said, taking a seat and wrapping her hands around the warm coffee mug. The heat seeped into her fingers, grounding her as she took a careful sip. Daniel sat across from her, his eyes studying her face as if trying to read the thoughts that flitted behind her guarded expression. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, the question laced with genuine concern. She nodded, setting the cup down and looking up at him. "Better than I have in a long time." A smile curved his lips, but it was fleeting. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, leaning back. "Sophie, I don't want to rush you, but I think we should talk about what comes next." Her pulse quickened at the shift in conversation. The comfort of the room suddenly felt like a fragile thing, ready to shatter with the weight of reality. She tore off a small piece of a croissant and took her time chewing it, buying herself a few extra seconds. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, her voice almost lost to the soft morning breeze that whispered through the cracked window. "I've been surviving day to day for so long. Planning for anything beyond that feels impossible." Daniel's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened with an empathy that made her chest tighten. "It's not impossible," he said. "Not if you let someone help." The simplicity of his statement made her throat constrict. She glanced out the window, the view of the city blurring slightly as unshed tears threatened to spill. She hated how easily the kindness in his words could unravel her. "I don't know how to let someone help," she said finally, her voice wavering. "I've been alone for so long. Depending on someone else feels like handing them the power to break me." Daniel didn't look away. He nodded slowly, understanding settling into his expression. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes, Sophie, but I can promise that I won't let you go through this alone. You deserve more than just survival." The words sank into her like a lifeline, tethering her to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way forward that didn't involve fighting tooth and nail for every breath. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken hopes and fears. After a moment, Sophie broke the silence, looking down at her hands. "If I stay, if I try to rebuild, I need to do it on my terms. Slowly." Daniel's smile was small but genuine. "Whatever pace you need," he said. "This isn't a sprint. It's a start." She nodded, the weight of the past lifting just enough for her to breathe easier. The smell of coffee and pastries filled the room, mingling with the crisp morning air. And for the first time in years, Sophie felt the smallest flicker of something she thought she'd lost: hope. Daniel raised his cup in a small toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes holding hers with a mixture of determination and warmth. Sophie picked up her cup, mirroring his gesture. "To new beginnings." The sound of their cups clinking filled the room, an almost insignificant noise, but to Sophie, it was the sound of something breaking. Walls, barriers, the chains of fear that had kept her from reaching out. And as the morning sun bathed the room in light, she let herself believe that this was the first step toward a life she could call her own again. The day unfolded slowly, with a kind of calm that Sophie hadn't felt in years. She spent the morning wrapped in a borrowed sweater and jeans that Daniel had found for her, moving through the house with cautious curiosity. Each room she passed held echoes of a life she'd never known. Expensive furniture, framed photographs that hinted at connections and accomplishments. It was a world apart from her own. Daniel, true to his word, gave her space. He made a few phone calls from his study and checked in briefly with the restaurant staff, leaving her to find her footing. As the hours ticked by, the reality of her surroundings became less foreign, though no less overwhelming. By early afternoon, Sophie found herself drawn to the library. It was a warm room, lined wall-to-wall with books that ranged from thick, leather-bound classics to modern business titles. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, pooling on the polished wood floor. She trailed her fingers along the spines of books, the scent of old pages mingling with the faint, sweet smell of the garden outside. "You always did love books," Daniel's voice came from the doorway, making her start slightly. He stood there, arms folded, watching her with an expression that balanced curiosity and nostalgia. Sophie chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. "I used to lose hours in the school library," she said, a wistful smile pulling at her lips. "It was the only place where I felt like I could escape." Daniel walked in, the afternoon sun catching on his dark hair. "I remember. You'd pull me into those old reading corners and make me promise to read the same book so we could talk about it later." She laughed, a real laugh this time, and it surprised them both. "You always complained, said the stories were too long." "I did," Daniel admitted, a grin breaking the serious lines of his face. "But I secretly liked it. It was an excuse to stay close to you." The air between them shifted, charged with memories that neither had dared to revisit until now. Sophie's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful look as she glanced down at the book she'd picked up, a worn copy of Great Expectations. "I thought about those times a lot," she said quietly, running her thumb along the edge of the pages, "especially when things got hard." Daniel's smile softened into something more somber. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until he was just a few feet away. "I wish I'd known what you were going through. I would have done something. Anything." Sophie looked up at him, eyes searching his face for the regret she knew was genuine. "We were kids, Daniel. We didn't know how to save each other back then." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in the space between them. "But we're not kids now," he said, the determination in his voice clear. "We have a chance to do better this time." The room grew quiet again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they were both standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, but neither was willing to take the first step without the other. After a moment, Daniel gestured toward the armchair by the window. "Sit with me? I'd like to hear more about where you've been, if you're ready to share." Sophie hesitated, the urge to protect her story warring with the desire to let someone else carry it, even if just for a moment. Finally, she nodded and took a seat, drawing her legs up and wrapping her arms around them. "It wasn't pretty," she began, her voice steady but low. "After my parents died, there was no one to keep me safe. I bounced around from one foster home to another until I turned 18. Then it was a series of bad jobs, worse landlords, and barely enough to eat most days." Daniel's eyes never wavered from her, and she felt the warmth of his attention as she spoke, unspooling the story that had lived in the shadows for so long. She told him about the nights spent on cold park benches, the odd jobs that paid pennies, and the few moments of kindness that stood out like beacons in a sea of hardship. "Some days, it was easier to keep moving than to stay still," she admitted. "Staying in one place meant facing everything I didn't want to think about. So I just kept going." Daniel's expression hardened with resolve, but he said nothing until she fell silent, the exhaustion of recounting her story evident in the slump of her shoulders. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met," he said softly, "and I don't say that lightly." Sophie felt the corners of her mouth lift in a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes but hinted at the possibility of trust. "I'm tired of being strong all the time," she confessed. "You don't have to be, not alone, at least," Daniel replied, his voice unwavering. He reached over, placing his hand lightly on hers. The touch was tentative, a question rather than a statement. She looked down at their hands, the contrast stark and meaningful, and let out a slow breath. "Maybe it's time I learned how to stay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Daniel's grip tightened, just enough to convey that he'd heard, that he understood. Outside, the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the room. But inside, amidst the rows of books and shared memories, Sophie felt a glimmer of warmth, a spark that told her she wasn't as alone as she had once believed. The light in the library dimmed as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow that softened the room's edges. Sophie leaned back in the armchair, letting the last of her story linger in the air between them. The silence was no longer uncomfortable, but rather a shared acknowledgement of everything that had been lost and everything that still remained to be rebuilt. Daniel stayed beside her, his fingers still lightly touching hers, as if afraid to break the fragile connection they'd managed to form. His gaze shifted to the window, where the sky was painted in deepening shades of amber and violet. The quiet moments with Sophie had always been the ones that meant the most, and tonight was no different. "I used to wonder where you were," Daniel said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if confessing a secret. "Every time I reached another milestone, college graduation, opening this restaurant, I'd think about what you'd say, if you'd be proud." Sophie looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She hadn't allowed herself to imagine that someone from her past might think of her with anything but pity or indifference. The idea that Daniel had carried thoughts of her through his years of success was both comforting and bittersweet. "I didn't know," she said, her voice trembling with something she couldn't quite name. "I thought I was just a memory, part of a past you'd moved on from." Daniel's eyes met hers, filled with a sincerity that made her heart tighten. "Some memories don't fade," he said, "and some people leave a mark that no amount of time can erase." The intensity of his words wrapped around her, both warming and terrifying her. The walls she had built so high and so strong over the years seemed to waver under the weight of that gaze, and Sophie found herself on the precipice of letting them fall completely. A knock at the library door startled them both. Daniel cleared his throat and pulled back slightly, though his eyes lingered on hers for a moment longer. "Come in," he called. The door opened to reveal Marcus, the head chef, who gave them both a curious glance before focusing on Daniel. "Sorry to interrupt," Marcus said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed out of place in the quiet room. "But I wanted to go over tomorrow night's menu before I head out." Daniel nodded, the shift in his demeanor immediate. He stood, casting a brief look at Sophie that promised they weren't finished with their conversation. "Give me a minute, Marcus," he said, and the chef nodded, stepping back into the hallway. Turning back to Sophie, Daniel's expression softened. "I need to take care of this, but if you're hungry, there's more food in the kitchen. Make yourself at home, all right?" She nodded, a small smile ghosting her lips. "I will. Thanks, Daniel." He lingered a moment longer before heading to the door. The room felt colder without his presence, and Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The conversation had stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't dared hope for in years: connection. Pushing herself up from the chair, she wandered into the hallway. The house was quiet, with only the muffled sound of Marcus and Daniel's voices trailing from the nearby study. Sophie followed the corridor until it opened into a spacious kitchen with marble countertops and stainless steel appliances. It was immaculate, the kind of kitchen designed for show but not use, though the faint aroma of spices suggested otherwise. Sophie opened a cabinet and found a glass, filling it with water from the tap. The cool liquid soothed her dry throat as she took slow sips, letting the moment settle over her. Just as she set the glass down, she heard footsteps approaching. Turning, she found Marcus standing in the doorway, his expression curious but kind. "You must be Sophie," he said, crossing his arms. The way he said her name, with casual familiarity, caught her off guard. "Yes," she replied, a touch of nervousness in her voice. "I'm sorry if I'm in the way." Marcus shook his head, a grin breaking through the serious lines of his face. "Not at all. We've all heard stories about you over the years. Daniel mentioned you a lot back in the day." Sophie's eyes widened. The idea that Daniel had spoken about her, even in passing, was both surprising and strange. "He did?" "Yeah, you were like a ghost he couldn't forget," Marcus said, chuckling softly. "It's good to see you're more than a memory now." The warmth in his voice eased some of her tension, and she managed a small smile. "It's good to be here," she said, though the truth of that statement still felt new and fragile. Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "Well, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. Daniel's a good man, but sometimes he forgets that people need more than words. They need actions." Sophie met his gaze, the unspoken message clear. She nodded, gratitude swelling in her chest. "Thank you, Marcus." He gave her one last nod before heading out, leaving her alone in the kitchen once more. Sophie looked around, the kitchen now feeling a little less foreign, a little more like a place she might come to know. The idea of staying, of letting herself be part of this new chapter, no longer felt so impossible. and as the sun fully set outside, casting the room in a warm, golden glow, Sophie felt the stirrings of something she thought she'd lost forever, a sense of belonging. The quiet of the evening settled over Daniel's home like a soft blanket. Sophie found herself lingering in the kitchen, the warmth of Marcus's words echoing in her mind. The idea that Daniel had carried memories of her throughout the years was both unsettling and comforting. She took another sip of water and stared out the window into the darkness, the city lights twinkling like scattered stars. The soft thud of footsteps behind her made her turn. Daniel stood in the doorway, his eyes searching hers for any hint of unease. He looked more relaxed now, the intensity of their earlier conversation tempered by a sense of calm. "I see Marcus found you," Daniel said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Sophie nodded, setting her glass down. "He did. He told me you used to talk about me." The statement was simple, but it hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Daniel's smile faded into something more thoughtful. He walked over to the counter and leaned against it, his gaze drifting out the window. "I did," he admitted, his voice low. "You were a part of my life that I never really let go of, even when I tried to." Sophie felt her chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing into the space between them. "Why didn't you try to find me?" she asked, the question that had been clawing at her finally finding voice. Daniel's eyes met hers, filled with regret. "I did, at first, but you'd vanished, and the more time passed, the more it felt like you were a chapter that had closed. Or maybe one that I didn't deserve to reopen." The honesty in his voice broke through Sophie's defenses, and she nodded slowly. The years of separation had been filled with so many questions, so many assumptions. But hearing him now, she understood that they had both been prisoners of their own choices and fears. "I was angry for a long time," Sophie said softly, the admission tasting bittersweet. "Angry at you, at the world, at myself." But then the anger turned into something else, just a numb acceptance. Daniel's expression darkened with the shadow of shared pain. "I wish I could change what happened, but I can't. All I can do now is be here, if you'll let me." Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the familiar urge to put up her guard, to push him away before he could disappoint her. But this time, she resisted. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him. The man who had built a life out of ambition, who had risen to heights she could only dream of, yet still stood here, vulnerable in front of her. "I'm not the same person you knew," she said, a warning and a plea wrapped in one. "I know," he replied, taking a step closer, "and I want to know the person you are now." The sincerity in his words made her heart ache. She nodded, unable to speak as emotion caught in her throat. They stood in silence, the unspoken agreement settling between them like a promise. The sound of a distant phone ringing broke the moment, and Daniel glanced toward the hallway, his brows knitting together. "I should get that," he said, hesitating as if torn between responsibilities. "It's okay," Sophie said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Go." Daniel nodded, offering her one last look before disappearing down the hallway. Sophie watched him go, the space he left behind feeling strangely empty. But it was a different kind of emptiness than what she was used to. This one held possibility. She walked over to the kitchen table and sat down, letting the day's events wash over her. The house was so quiet. She could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. Her thoughts drifted to the past, the countless nights she had spent wondering if anyone remembered her, if anyone cared. And now, here she was, in the last place she'd ever expected to be, finding answers to questions she hadn't dared to ask. Minutes later, Daniel returned, his expression slightly more serious. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his eyes focused on hers. "That was the restaurant," he said. "There's an event tomorrow night, a charity auction we're hosting. I usually stay late to oversee things, but I can send someone else if you'd rather not be alone." Sophie hesitated, the thought of being left in his house, surrounded by his life, making her feel vulnerable. But then she reminded herself of the promise she'd made moments earlier, to stay, to let herself believe in the possibility of something more. "It's okay," she said, surprising even herself. "I think I'll be fine." Daniel's eyes softened, a flicker of relief crossing his features. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." "I'm sure," she replied, this time with more confidence. "Maybe I could even help out somehow. If you need an extra pair of hands." A slow smile spread across Daniel's face, one that hinted at hope. "I'd like that," he said. "I think it could be good for both of us." The warmth in his voice eased the knot in her chest. For the first time in years, Sophie felt the stirrings of anticipation. Not the dread of what tomorrow might bring, but the curiosity of what it might hold. The following day unfolded with a quiet anticipation that seemed to hum through the walls of Daniel's home. Sophie woke early, the soft morning light casting a warm glow across the room. She dressed in clothes Daniel had provided, simple but comfortable, and found herself standing in front of the mirror longer than usual. The woman staring back at her looked different, the exhaustion in her eyes softened by rest, and a subtle hint of color had returned to her cheeks. The kitchen was empty when she entered, but a note on the table, written in Daniel's neat handwriting, caught her eye. "Good morning. There's breakfast in the fridge, and I'll be back this afternoon to take you to the event. Feel free to explore the house or relax." A small smile crossed her lips as she folded the note and set it down. The thought of attending the event felt both exhilarating and daunting. It had been years since she'd worn anything other than practical, worn clothes, or set foot in places where she'd be surrounded by people who didn't know her struggles. But today, she would try. She spent the morning wandering through the house, pausing at photos of Daniel with prominent figures, colleagues, and friends. One picture in particular caught her attention. Daniel standing beside an older man with sharp eyes and a warm smile. The frame was inscribed with a simple note, "To my mentor and friend, always." Her curiosity piqued, Sophie made her way to the library, her sanctuary from the previous evening. She curled up in the armchair by the window, the view of the city calming her. Time slipped by unnoticed until the sound of the front door opening and closing echoed through the house. A moment later, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression softening when he saw her. "Hey," he said, a small smile breaking through the formality that usually cloaked him. "You settled in okay?" "Yeah," Sophie said, uncurling from the chair. "I found your library. I hope that's all right." Daniel's eyes lit up. "Of course. I'm glad you did. It's one of my favorite places." He glanced at his watch, then back at her. "We don't have much time before we need to leave for the event. There's something upstairs for you, a dress, if you'd like to wear it tonight." Sophie's eyes widened, a mix of gratitude and apprehension twisting in her chest. "A dress? Daniel, Please," he interrupted gently, raising a hand. "I wanted you to have it. No strings, no expectations. Just something nice for you." The sincerity in his voice left her momentarily speechless. She nodded, the words caught in her throat. "Thank you," she managed, the sentiment wrapped in layers of emotion she couldn't untangle. Daniel's smile deepened. "I'll be in the study getting ready. Take your time." Upstairs, Sophie found the guest room transformed. Laid across the bed was an elegant dress, deep emerald in color, its fabric shimmering subtly as it caught the light. Next to it, a small box held simple, yet exquisite jewelry, a pair of pearl earrings and a delicate bracelet. She ran her fingers over the dress, the texture rich and unfamiliar. It had been years since she had worn anything so beautiful. The hours slipped by, and soon Sophie found herself standing in front of the mirror, the dress fitting her perfectly, the green bringing out the depth in her eyes. She put on the earrings and bracelet, their weight foreign but comforting. When she stepped back to take in the full effect, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back at her was someone who looked like she belonged, even if she didn't feel it yet. A knock at the door drew her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she said, turning as Daniel stepped into the room. He wore a tailored black suit, the crisp lines accentuating his lean frame. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You look stunning," Daniel said, the sincerity in his voice matching the surprise in his eyes. Sophie's cheeks flushed. "Thank you. You don't look too bad yourself." He chuckled, a sound that warmed the space between them. "Ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, taking a deep breath. The drive to La Belle Époque was filled with quiet conversation, the kind that carried an unspoken understanding. Daniel navigated the familiar streets, the city alive with the glow of streetlights and the hum of evening traffic. When they arrived, the restaurant was already bustling with activity. The grand facade shimmered under the golden lights, and a red carpet stretched out to the entrance, where well-dressed guests mingled and photographers snapped pictures. Daniel stepped out first and offered Sophie his hand. She took it, the warmth of his palm steadying her as they walked into the crowd. The buzz of conversation rose around them, but Daniel's presence beside her made it bearable. Inside, the restaurant was transformed. Tables were set with the finest china, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandeliers. The scent of gourmet dishes wafted through the air, mingling with the hum of anticipation. A few familiar faces greeted Daniel, their eyes flicking to Sophie with polite curiosity. She felt their stares, but the reassuring squeeze of Daniel's hand grounded her. He introduced her simply as a friend, and she saw no judgment in his gaze, only pride. As the evening wore on, Sophie found herself relaxing. The conversations flowed, and she even managed a few smiles and polite exchanges. But it wasn't until Daniel stepped away for a moment, leaving her by the edge of the room, that she felt the first pang of vulnerability. The laughter and chatter swirled around her, a reminder of the life she hadn't belonged to for so long. Before the moment could overwhelm her, a soft voice broke through the noise. "Enjoying the evening?" Sophie turned to see Marcus, dressed sharply in a suit, his familiar grin putting her at ease. "More than I thought I would," she admitted, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "Good," Marcus said, raising his glass in a toast. "It's about time this place saw some new stories." Sophie smiled, a genuine one this time, as she glanced across the room and found Daniel looking back at her. A warmth spread through her chest. The evening was far from over, but in that moment, surrounded by laughter, light, and the promise of a new chapter, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years: hope, steady and unwavering. The soft clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation enveloped Sophie as she moved through the crowd at La Belle Époque. The evening had unfolded like a dream, each moment more surreal than the last. Guests mingled, their laughter punctuating the elegant music played by a live quartet. Sophie felt herself ease into the space, the initial nerves giving way to a tentative confidence she hadn't expected. Daniel returned to her side, his smile warm and unguarded. "How are you holding up?" he asked, leaning close enough that only she could hear. She met his eyes, finding reassurance in the calm blue depths. "Better than I thought I would," she admitted. "Thank you for this, Daniel. For everything." His expression softened, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "You don't need to thank me, Sophie. I'm glad you're here." Their conversation was interrupted by the chime of a crystal bell, signaling the start of the evening's main event. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped onto the small stage set up near the front of the dining area, raising his hand for attention. The guests turned, conversations quieting as the man spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for this special occasion. We're gathered here not just for an evening of fine dining and entertainment, but to make a difference. All proceeds from tonight's auction will go to the City Youth Initiative, an organization that supports underprivileged children in San Francisco." A round of applause followed, and Sophie felt a pang of emotion at the mention of the cause. She glanced at Daniel, who was watching the stage with an unreadable expression. Before she could ask, the auctioneer began to announce the first item, and the room's focus shifted. The auction proceeded smoothly, filled with spirited bidding and the occasional laugh as friendly rivalries sparked over prized items. Sophie watched, fascinated by the generosity and camaraderie on display. It was a world that had once seemed unreachable, a world she had convinced herself she'd never be a part of. Yet here she stood, no longer just an outsider looking in. Halfway through the auction, Daniel's name was called to the stage. He leaned in, his voice low and warm. "I'll be right back." Sophie nodded, her heart fluttering as she watched him walk to the front. The room greeted him with enthusiastic applause, a testament to the respect he commanded. He took the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the guests before landing on Sophie for the briefest of moments. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Daniel began, his voice confident but carrying an underlying current of emotion. "This restaurant has always been more than just a place for fine dining. It's been a testament to the belief that when people come together, they can create something remarkable. Tonight, we're not just enjoying the best this city has to offer. We're giving back to the community that's given us so much." The sincerity in his words struck a chord, and the room fell silent in a shared moment of reflection. Sophie felt her chest tighten as she watched him speak, realizing that this version of Daniel, passionate, driven, and kind, was the man she had always hoped he would become. As he finished, the room erupted in applause, and Daniel stepped down, returning to her side. He caught her gaze, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them. "You have a way with words," Sophie said, her voice laced with admiration. Daniel smiled, a touch of color rising to his cheeks. "Only when it matters." The final item of the auction was announced, breaking the moment between them. It was an original painting by a renowned local artist, a piece that depicted the city skyline bathed in the warm hues of dawn. The bids climbed quickly, the room buzzing with excitement. "Going once, going twice." The auctioneer paused, looking over the crowd. "Sold to Mr. Harrington." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room, and Sophie turned to Daniel in surprise. He shrugged, a boyish grin spreading across his face. "It's for a good cause." Sophie laughed, the sound full and unrestrained, catching both of them off guard. The guests around them turned with smiles, some joining in the laughter as the atmosphere lightened. It was as though a shared understanding swept through the room, one that said even amidst luxury, there was room for moments of genuine joy. The night wound down, and as the final guests began to trickle out, Daniel and Sophie found themselves on the terrace overlooking the bay. The city lights shimmered on the water, reflecting the countless stories playing out below. The cool breeze whispered through the trees, and Sophie shivered slightly. Daniel noticed, slipping off his suit jacket and draping it over her shoulders. "Better?" he asked, his voice quiet, intimate. She nodded, pulling the jacket around herself and inhaling the faint scent of his cologne. "Yes, thank you." They stood in silence, the world around them moving at its usual pace, but their small corner of the terrace felt timeless. Sophie glanced at Daniel, the glow of the city casting his profile in soft shadows. "Tonight was more than I could have imagined," she said. "I felt like I belonged, even if just for a moment." Daniel turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers. "It wasn't just for a moment, Sophie. This is your place too, if you want it." Her breath caught, the weight of his words pressing against the doubts that still clung to her. But in the warmth of his gaze, she found the courage to let go. "I think I do," she whispered, her voice carrying the tentative hope that had grown within her. Daniel's smile was slow, spreading across his face until it reached his eyes. He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until there was only room for honesty. "Then welcome home," he said, the sincerity in his voice echoing in her heart. The city below seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing the quiet promise that passed between them. And in that moment, under the stars and the watchful lights of San Francisco, Sophie felt that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found her way back to where she belonged. The crisp night air held a gentle stillness as Sophie and Daniel lingered on the terrace, the quiet between them rich with unsaid words. Below, San Francisco's heartbeat pulsed in the form of city lights and distant sounds, a reminder that the world moved on, even as they stood suspended in their own moment. Sophie turned her gaze out toward the bay, the dark expanse broken by the shimmer of moonlight on the water. She wrapped Daniel's jacket tighter around her shoulders, its warmth a comfort she hadn't known she craved. The steady rhythm of her heart felt foreign, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of peace. Daniel leaned on the terrace railing, his eyes drifting over the same scene. He seemed at ease, a hint of a smile playing on his lips as if he, too, recognized the shift between them. After a moment, he broke the silence. "I've spent so many nights out here, looking at that same view, wondering what was missing," he said. his voice low but clear. Now I know. Sophie's breath caught, her pulse quickening as she turned to face him. The weight of what he was saying pressed against the doubts that had clung to her like shadows. But there, in the soft glow of the terrace lights, Daniel's eyes held a certainty that steadied her. "I never thought I'd find myself here," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Not just in this city, or this restaurant, but with you." It felt like a dream that belonged to someone else. Daniel's smile softened as he stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. "Dreams have a way of changing when you least expect it," he said, lifting a hand to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes they find their way back." The tenderness of his touch made Sophie's chest tighten, the walls she'd built over years of struggle crumbling away piece by piece. She closed her eyes, letting herself feel the moment, the warmth of his presence, the hum of the city, and the realization that she was no longer alone. When she opened her eyes, Daniel was still there, watching her with an expression that held both hope and promise. The city lights reflected in his gaze, and she saw her own reflection there, not as the girl who had lost everything, but as the woman who had found her way back. "I'm scared," she admitted, the vulnerability in her voice breaking through the last of her defenses. "But I'm tired of running." Daniel nodded, understanding settling between them like an unspoken agreement. "Me too," he said, "but we don't have to do this alone." The words were simple, yet they held the weight of everything they had been through, both together and apart. And in that moment, the city seemed to blur around them, leaving only the two of them standing on that terrace, bound by the shared truth of their pasts and the hope of their future. Daniel leaned in, hesitating just long enough for Sophie to close the distance, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both gentle and profound. It wasn't just an embrace. It was the culmination of years of separation, of lost chances and newfound courage. The taste of promise lingered as they broke apart, eyes meeting with a mix of wonder and certainty. A breeze swept through, rustling the leaves and carrying with it the faint sounds of the city. Sophie smiled, a real, uninhibited smile that reached her eyes. "I think I'm ready," she said, the declaration carrying more weight than either of them could measure. Daniel's fingers tightened gently on hers. "Then we'll face it all, one day at a time." As the city's lights continued to dance across the water, Sophie felt the last pieces of her past loosen their hold, making room for the life she was ready to build. With Daniel by her side and the promise of tomorrow stretching before them, she knew she had found her way home at last. And under the endless expanse of stars and the ever-watchful eyes of the city, two hearts that had once been separated found their rhythm, beating in unison with the quiet, steady pulse of hope. If you liked, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us using the thanks button. Until next time.